Julia Dean is a photographer, educator, writer, and founder of the Los Angeles Center of Photography. Currently, she serves as the director of the LA Photo Project, a collective of street, documentary, and news photographers that captures the pulse of Los Angeles. Julia's career began as an apprentice to the legendary photographer Berenice Abbott, and she later worked as a photo editor for the Associated Press. As a freelance photographer, her lens has taken her to over 45 countries documenting stories across the globe. And with more than 40 years of teaching experience, Julia has shaped countless photographers and continues to inspire through her work. These days, her focus is closer to home, capturing the vibrant and evolving streets of Los Angeles. And today on The Crit House, Julia Dean talks about her myFIVE images from Bernice Abbott, Margaret Bork-White, Dorothia Lang, Mary Ellen Mark, and HelenLevitt. Well, Julia Dean, thank you for joining us on The Crit House. It's a pleasure to have you on the program.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm honored.
Yeah, it'll be a good conversation. One of the things we try to do is get people from who have different experiences. So maybe a photographer, a curator, an editor, publisher, writer, the people who have, but you've done a lot of different things. So you have a lot of different perspectives from not only being a photographer yourself, but an educator, curator, I guess, too. So who are you as a photographer? How do you tell people, or how do you talk about yourself as a photographer?
Well, my background is journalism, photojournalism. And so I did that for a number of years. I traveled around the world. I really wanted to work as a socially concerned photographer, doing work around the world. People that were doing good work around the world. I wanted to do stories on them and things that were happening. And I got involved I was freelancing basically, and I hooked up with various nonprofits, religious newspapers, relief agencies, and I'd cobble together a few assignments, and off I'd go for a month or 3 or 6 months was my longest one. And I would make just enough money to be there and do this work, and I did it for a decade, and it really meant a lot to me, and that's really what I wanted to kind of do for the rest of my life. But it's very difficult to find those kinds of jobs.
Yeah.
So ultimately, I came to LA and started a school, which meant I couldn't be on the road like that anymore. All my life as a photographer, I'd called myself a photojournalist or a documentary photographer. And so by the time I came here and started my school, and I wasn't doing that work anymore, I mean, I was still doing some freelance assignments, photojournalistic freelance assignments, but not like that. And I kind of wondered who I was as a photographer. And so I started taking people on all these travel workshops, and I took people on 25 travel workshops in a 10-year period.
Wow.
I started my school in 1999, and a year later I started those travel workshops, and I did that. And so I took them to all these cities, and so I got to shoot on the streets of all these cities, and I loved it. And I came home one day to Los Angeles, and I said, why am I not shooting on the streets of Los Angeles, for goodness sakes? I could just be working on a project right here in my own home, my hometown.
Yeah.
So that's what I started doing. So in 2010, I started concentrating on shooting on the streets of Los Angeles. And so now I call myself an LA street shooter on top of photojournalist and documentary photographer.
Well, I appreciate some of that work you do in downtown is beautiful. Keep it up.
Thank you.
So we had an assignment for you. You had to choose 5 images that have influenced you or mean something to you, either as a professional or a person. What did you think of when you came up with those 5 images? What was your thought process?
Well, when you first reached out to me, I thought, oh, how am I ever going to pick 5 people that have influenced me when so many people at this stage of my career, I've been doing this for almost 5 decades, so a lot of people have influenced me, a lot of photographers, and so I thought I really gave it a lot of thought actually, and I thought, how can I make this, because of the teacher that I am, how can I make this a cohesive little talk that becomes meaningful to my life? And so I chose 5 women, 5 pioneering women.
Yes.
that I had either actually met along the way or learned about along the way. And each one of them leads me into the next. And all five of them incorporate documentary photography, photojournalism, and street photography, which has basically been my life as a photographer.
Perfect. Well, let's take a look at your five images.
All right.
Well, so we'll start off with Bernice Abbott and this lovely image. This is New York City, I assume, right?
This is New York City, yes. Well, Bernice, the reason I'm starting with Bernice is because she was my very first, um, well, after my first photography teacher in college, she was my very first photography mentor. I had the amazing good fortune of living and studying under her for a year when I was 23 and she was 80. I had just graduated from college. Her photographs were taken, most of, like this was taken with an 8x10 camera.
Yeah.
And so was a whole decade of work that she did in New York that was named Changing New York, which is the name of the book. But what happened was she had been in Paris in the 20s as a young person, and she came back to, and she discovered Eugene Atget, and she came back to New York to try to get a publisher for the Atget book. And she looked around and went, this is in 1929 when she'd been in Paris almost a decade. She kind of looked around and went, oh my goodness, everything's changing so much. I need to come back. She went back to Paris, packed all up and came back to New York, and for the next 10 years photographed on the streets of New York as things were changing and being torn down. And so this is a really important body of work that she captured during that time. This particular picture was taken from the Empire State Building, not on the top of it, but from a window somewhere, because at the time, this was like 1932, when this was taken, right around Christmas time. The Empire State Building had just been built a year before, and so a lot of the offices and were vacant in the top floors. So she was able to work her way in and get this picture. She said it
Is
was a 15-minute exposure.
Oh my goodness, really?
And
Wow.
she only had like one shot to get it, because of she started at 4:30 and it was in December and she didn't have much time to get the shot. But this is one of her most famous shots.
It's
Now, I used an 8x10 camera for a short time when I was her apprentice because Hank O'Neill, her biographer of 11 books, he had one and he lent it to me. But I am not I'm such a journalist. I'm a candid, quick photographer. So the 8x10 didn't work out very well for me. Though I was doing a project on the last of the general stores, it just wasn't me. So Bernice's photographs and her technique were not what inspired my photography. She just inspired me in so many ways. I learned the importance of having a project and wanting to wake up every morning and go do it if you had some time off. I
yeah,
still think about this.
yeah,
Like 50 years later, almost 50 years later, she just put it in my head. You should always have a project. You should always have a personal project that means something to you. I learned discipline from working at home because I would wake up and work in her home every day. I'd never done that before. I always went off to school and off to work and off,
yeah.
off to places. I learned how to print from a master printer. I became myself I hesitate to call myself a master printer, but at one time I was pretty close to it. I learned about Paris in the 20s. She gave me personal stories about James Joyce and Edna St. Vincent Millay and Peggy Guggenheim and Sylvia Beach and everybody that she was meeting, along the way. And so I learned about that. And I was just this young kid from small town Nebraska, so
Oh,
it was all new and important to me. I learned what it means to have a mentor and the importance of passing information on.
thanks for showing that. Now, your second image comes from Margaret Bork White. Tell us.
Yes, and so interestingly, so Bernice and I talked about so many things, and one of the things she talked to me about was, she was a woman in a man's world back then, and she had to compete with everybody, and a lot of people. She was brilliant, and she was technically just a wizard. This is why Man Ray loved her so much because he hired her as a young person, a 20-something person in the darkroom, and she was such a whiz at it that he actually eventually said, use my cameras and become a photographer, right? She was so good at everything. And she was inventing things and she was doing this and that and the other thing. But she said she would feel jealous over people who were not as talented as her who got the job.
Ah,
But she was never jealous of a great photographer. And she often brought up Margaret Burke White.
hmm,
And that's why I have her second here, because I love the fact that Bernice was ready to compliment the hugely talented other photographer and no female photographer at that, which was
yeah,
really great. And she just thought a lot of Margaret Burke White, as do I. She was another pioneering photographer. I mean, she was born in I think it was 1904. So these are women that are way ahead of their time. I mean, at 20, I think it was at 25 years old, she got a job with Henry Luce at Fortune magazine. And it wasn't much longer that it was 1936 that she worked when he started Life magazine. And so she was young when she started getting all this these breaks and this acclaim for all of the great work that she was doing. This was about a flood in Louisville, Kentucky. And so lots and lots of people were displaced and died and so she was covering that story for Life magazine. That's what I was looking for. This is just such a vision of hers, to see something like this where the white family has got this great life and they even have a dog in the car and they're going down the road and there's no way like the American way
yeah,
and then the African American families are waiting in line for food.
yeah.
So it's just a juxtaposition of this photograph is so intense and so telling. I,
It
I
is.
just love what all these women have done to bring light to social problems in our country and around the world. She was doing things that she would beat men to the war zone. She would just she was just an amazing woman that I admire greatly. And I've read her biography, I've read her autobiography, I've read her biography twice. I just finished it again. I have a whole shelf of her photographs over of her books. I just admire her. I just admire her so much.
All right, let's go on to your third image from Dorothea Lang. This might be the image that is featured more often than any other image on this.
Right, which is why I picked it because I knew everybody would know it from the Farm Security Administration time period from the Depression during the 30s, 40s. So Dorothea Lang was one of the. I mean, there were a bunch of photographers that worked for the FSA during this time period. And when I was with Bernice, again, all of this kind of comes back to Bernice in a way because while I was with her. I became friends and still am all these years later with her biographer. I mentioned him a
Yeah.
little while ago, Hank O'Neill. He was 37 when I met him. He's 84 now. So we've aged together. But anyway, he had just written a book. So when I first met him, he now has done 11 books on Bernice. Many of them were Steidl. This particular book he wrote was called A Vision Shared, and it was all about the FSA photographers. And somehow my young life had missed learning about that. Even though I went to RIT, I don't know if I wasn't paying attention in my history of photography class, or I mean, that's how I discovered Bernice was my history of photography class. So,
Great.
but anyway, somehow I missed the FSA the body of work. And when I saw Hank's book and I saw all these people, I just went, "Oh my God, this is what I want to do. I want to do documentary work that is socially concerned and I want to help bring awareness to problems in the world." I barely knew that kind of photography even existed because I was very much a young, naive um, you know, person in photography at the time. So I studied this book. It's just so worn out now after all these years because I looked at it every page so many times. So that's how I met Dorothea Lang and she so Bernice taught me what documentary photography is in general. Margaret Burke White was a photojournalist. That's what made me realize I wanted to be a photojournalist. Dorothea Lang was a documentary photography of social concern.
Hmm.
That's where that came in. This woman, this woman in this picture, her name is actually Florence Owens Thompson, and nobody knew her name for a very long time. She's Native American, and these were her kids. They were in a peat pickers camp in Nepoma, California, when this was taken in 1936.
Your fourth image is now from Mary Ellen Mark.
I had the pleasure of meeting Mary Ellen over the years, and she even taught for me at my school a few times. So I was really pleased about that. I remember when I called her to ask her, I was really nervous, and she said yes. I was so excited I could hardly wait to announce it. But we first met when I lived in Maine the second time. I lived with Bernice Abbott in Maine in the middle of the woods. And then the second time I lived in Maine, a decade later, I was teaching the full-time program at the Maine Photo Workshops. So I was there all year long for a couple of years. And that's where I met Mary Ellen because she came up to teach and to be there for various things. And so that's how I remember us having our first conversation. I was really pleased by getting to talk to her. And I just followed her. I knew all about her way before meeting her in 1988, but I'd shown her work to all my students, and I used to teach photojournalism at the University of Nebraska too. And so, of course, all my students learned about Mary Ellen Mark back then, and all about a picture story, and what a picture story is, and a documentary project, and working closely with people and gaining trust. So I learned all that from looking at her work. I mean, she's got this project that I'm sure you know called Ward 81, where she got into this hospital of mentally a mental hospital of women. And the photographs are so intimate and so personal, and so is this story here that she did. This girl's name was named Lily. She was 13. She was part of this story that Mary Ellen did on street kids in Seattle. It was a Life magazine assignment. The reason that they had her do it is because Seattle had been voted like the most livable city
Mm.
at that time, yet they still had street kids. So she got sent up there to do this story on kids living on the street in this city that had been named, the most livable city. This was on Pike Street, this particular picture, and it was taken in 1983. The person that she concentrated on, Tina, or Tiny, sorry,
Tiny, yeah.
Tiny. Tiny was they became friends for many, many years, and Mary Ellen Mark actually even offered to adopt Tiny if she would go to school, but Tiny didn't want to go to school, so she stayed on the streets.
And your last image, HelenLevitt, who you've referenced earlier in this conversation.
Right now, so even though HelenLevitt was born in 1913, I put her last because even though Mary Ellen Mark was the youngest of all these, because she was the last one who I discovered to influence my work. Because when I started shooting on the streets, I started concentrating on street photographers, both historic and contemporary.
Right.
And she was just, I mean, her street photography from New York in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, it's so brilliant. And back then in the 30s and 40s and even 50s, people didn't have TVs. They weren't inside. They didn't have
Yep.
computers. So everybody was on the
Yep.
streets.
The street was
All
where
the
life
kids
was.
were playing on the streets. So she's concentrated a lot on the kids, as children on the streets. But her photographs are so beautiful and they're so whimsical. And I had studied her work for a long time, but I hadn't really thought about it as being influential to my work until I started shooting on the street myself. But I showed her work to students for many, many years. And when I started shooting myself on the street, I wrote her a fan letter. And I just said, here's the funny part of the story is, I mean, I was seeing pictures of hers from the 30s and the 40s. I didn't think she was probably still alive. For some reason, I didn't realize that she was still alive. And when I found that out, I found a way to get in touch with her because I just wanted to say, I love you. I love your work. I just want to say thank you for letting me share it with all my students for all these years. And that's all. I didn't ask for anything. I just wanted That's what all of my letters were like. I just wanted to tell you how much I love you and your work. And she wrote me a postcard back with one of her pictures on it, and I framed it because of course it's like a 10-year-old getting an autograph from a movie star. I got an autograph from a famous photographer.
So
So
how do you show that in the frame? Do you show it with the autograph forward or the picture forward? It's hard to.
I know it's in a little plastic thing so you can turn it around and see
Oh,
the
there
back.
you go.
And
Perfect. Yeah.
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 She took this particular picture somewhere, it says in her book, between 1936 and 1948. So, but she shot all the way through I mean, she died at 96. She died in 2009.
Yeah.
So that's why I was able to reach out to her because I finally discovered that she was alive and maybe right around the time that maybe she might have died like 3 years after I
Yeah.
found out that she was still here with us. So I was so happy I got to communicate with her and just tell her how much I loved her work. And I love this particular picture because I love the layering in it. And you learn a lot from, there's so many photographers like Henri Cartier-Bresson and contemporary photographer like Alex Webb who does the layering so
Yeah.
beautifully. And so, that's the kind of street photography I love the most, where there's just there's a story in the background too, that is as beautiful as a story in the foreground. So, and that's what this picture kind of represents here.
Yeah, I was gonna actually, I'm glad you talked about that because I was going to ask you what it was about this image because she has so many just
So
iconic
many.
images, and this is one
And
you.
delightful ones too. They're all delightful. Some of them are just like the kids. But she was greatly influenced by Henri Cartier-Bresson, and people actually compare her. They say she's the New York version of the Paris version of him. So she was really pleased by that, by getting that kind of attention. She was pretty shy by all accounts.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you sharing that and the story as well. Julia Dean, thank you so much for coming on the Crit House and talking about your 5 images.
My pleasure.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. And thank you all for watching the Crit House.